December 1944, arrived with a cruelty that no war plan could fully predict. The Ardennes forest was swallowed by snow, roads turned to ice, and visibility collapsed into a gray, suffocating fog. It was in this frozen uncertainty that the German counteroffensive struck, fast, violent, and unexpected. The blow landed hardest on the shoulders of the 101st Airborne Division, encircled in the Belgian town of Bastogne, cut off from supplies, reinforcements, and hope. When the first reports reached Dwight D. Eisenhower, his reaction was not panic, but gravity. He understood immediately what was at stake. Bastogne was not just another town on a map. It was a crossroads, a hinge point. If it fell, the German advance could fracture the Allied line and drag the war into a far darker chapter. Eisenhower knew the situation was dire, but he also knew something else. This was the kind of crisis that revealed the true character of commanders. Far to the south, George S. Patton was already restless. His Third Army had been pushing hard, always pushing, always moving. Speed was his language, momentum his instinct. When the news of Bastogne reached him, Patton did not ask if he could help. He asked how fast he could turn his entire army north through snow-choked roads and hostile territory. It was a maneuver many believed impossible. Eisenhower watched Patton closely in those hours. He had often worried about Patton's recklessness, his hunger for glory, his disdain for restraint. Yet now, in the coldest moment of the war, Eisenhower saw that same aggression transform into something invaluable, decisive action when paralysis threatened everyone else. Patton spoke with absolute confidence. He said his army could pivot 90 degrees, attack into the teeth of winter, and reach Bastogne in days. Not weeks, days. Many in the room doubted him. Staff officers exchanged uneasy glances. Maps were studied again and again. The weather alone seemed like an unbeatable enemy. Eisenhower did not interrupt. When Patton finished, there was a long silence. Then Eisenhower asked one simple question. When can you start? Patton's answer was immediate. He said he had already started. That was the moment Eisenhower later reflected on most. Not the bravado, not the speed, but the preparation. Patton had anticipated the crisis before it fully arrived. He had planned for chaos, and now chaos had come exactly as expected. Eisenhower realized that whatever Patton's flaws, this was a commander who lived for moments like this. As the days passed, Bastogne held on by sheer will. The men of the 101st fought in frozen foxholes with dwindling ammunition and medical supplies. They were surrounded, shelled constantly, and offered surrender terms by the enemy. Their response, short, defiant, and legendary, echoed all the way up the chain of command. Eisenhower read it and understood the psychological weight of those words. This was not just resistance. It was defiance written in frost. Meanwhile, Patton's columns moved. Tanks crawled through snowdrifts. Trucks slid on ice. Men marched with numb hands and burning lungs. The pace was brutal, but Patton demanded it anyway. He said speed was mercy. Every hour saved meant lives spared in Bastogne. He drove his commanders relentlessly, not with cruelty, but with urgency that bordered on obsession. Eisenhower followed the progress reports closely. Each mile gained felt like a personal relief, each delay like a tightening knot. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself a fragile hope. Patton was doing what many believed could not be done. Privately, Eisenhower said something remarkable. He admitted that in this moment, Patton was exactly the man the war needed. Not the polished diplomat, not the cautious planner, but the relentless force who could bend reality through will and preparation. Eisenhower did not say this lightly. Coming from a man known for balance and restraint, it was quiet praise of the highest order. When Patton's spearhead finally broke through to Bastogne, the relief was overwhelming. The siege was not instantly ended, but the noose was cut. Supplies flowed in. Wounded were evacuated. Hope returned. The 101st was no longer alone. Eisenhower's reaction was measured, but deeply felt. He did not boast. He did not exaggerate. He said simply that Patton had delivered when the moment demanded it most. To Eisenhower, this was leadership stripped of ego, action aligned perfectly with necessity. Yet even in victory, Eisenhower was already thinking ahead. He understood that this success did not erase Patton's risks or his volatility, but it proved something undeniable when discipline and aggression aligned. They could change the course of history. The rescue of Bastogne was not just a tactical victory. It was a test of trust between two very different men. And for the first time, Eisenhower allowed himself to say, if only privately, that Patton had not just followed orders. He had saved an army. After Bastogne was relieved, the world saw maps changing and headlines celebrating movement. What it did not see were the quiet rooms where decisions were weighed, and where Eisenhower's words carried more meaning than any public statement ever could. He did not summon reporters. He summoned his thoughts, and in those moments, his view of Patton shifted in ways few ever fully understood. Eisenhower said that what Patton had done was not simply fast, it was disciplined speed. That distinction mattered to him. Anyone could charge forward, but only a commander who had prepared months in advance could turn an entire army in winter, under pressure, without collapsing supply lines or morale. Eisenhower recognized that this was not luck. It was intent made ready long before the crisis arrived. In staff meetings, Eisenhower defended Patton when others questioned the risks he had taken. He said that war did not reward hesitation during emergencies. He reminded them that Bastogne was not saved by perfect conditions, but by decisive leadership under impossible ones. For a man often described as cautious, Eisenhower was surprisingly firm on this point. Yet his praise was never loud. Eisenhower believed that excessive admiration could be as dangerous as excessive criticism, especially with a man like Patton. He understood Patton's hunger for recognition, and he knew how easily that hunger could turn reckless. So Eisenhower measured his words carefully, offering respect without feeding ego. Privately, Eisenhower said something revealing. That Patton's greatest strength was also his greatest risk. The same fire that drove him north through snow could, if unchecked, burn through alliances and long-term strategy. Eisenhower did not want to tame Patton's aggression. He wanted to aim it. Bastogne proved that when aimed correctly, it could save thousands of lives. The success also changed how Eisenhower viewed responsibility. He admitted that if Patton had failed, history would have judged the decision harshly, and rightly so. The burden of authorizing that movement rested squarely on Eisenhower's shoulders. He said leadership was not about avoiding blame, but accepting it before outcomes were known. Bastogne reinforced that belief more than any other moment of the war. As reports from the 101st filtered in, stories of relief, of supplies arriving, of wounded finally receiving care, Eisenhower felt a deep, personal relief. He did not express it openly, but those close to him noticed a shift. His posture softened. His voice steadied. The pressure that had weighed on him since the German offensive began finally eased. He acknowledged, in rare moments of candor, that Patton had saved more than a division. He had stabilized a front, restored confidence, and sent a message to both friend and foe. The Allies could absorb a blow and respond with overwhelming force. Eisenhower understood the psychological value of that message. Wars were not won by weapons alone. They were won by belief. Still, Eisenhower did not forget the cost. He spoke of the men lost along the frozen roads, of the exhaustion etched into every report. Victory, he reminded his staff, always came with a price, and it was his duty to ensure that price was never paid unnecessarily. Bastogne was necessary. That was the difference. Patton, meanwhile, sensed the change. Eisenhower's tone toward him was steadier, more trusting, but also more watchful. Their relationship entered a new phase, built on mutual recognition rather than suspicion alone. They did not become friends. They became something more functional and more fragile, partners bound by necessity. Eisenhower said that Patton had proven himself when it mattered most, but that proof came with expectation. From now on, Patton would be judged not only by how fast he moved, but by how well he aligned that speed with the broader purpose of the war. The margin for error had narrowed. In the quiet aftermath of Bastogne, Eisenhower reflected on leadership itself. He concluded that great commanders were not those without flaws, but those whose flaws could be managed without sacrificing outcomes. Patton fit that definition perfectly. Dangerous, brilliant, exhausting, and, in that winter, indispensable. Bastogne had not changed who Patton was. It had changed how Eisenhower saw him. Long after the guns around Bastogne quieted, Dwight D. Eisenhower continued to return to that winter in his thoughts. He did not remember it as a moment of triumph, but as a moment of reckoning. Leadership, he believed, revealed itself most clearly when choices carried irreversible consequences. Authorizing Patton's turn north had been one of those choices. If it failed, the responsibility would have been his alone. That truth stayed with him. What Eisenhower said about George S. Patton after Bastogne was never wrapped in grand speeches. It was quieter, heavier. He said Patton had done exactly what the situation demanded. Nothing more, nothing less. For Eisenhower, that was the highest praise a commander could receive. Not heroics for their own sake, but action aligned with necessity. Eisenhower also said that Bastogne proved something vital about command. Speed without purpose was recklessness, but speed guided by preparation was salvation. Patton had not improvised recklessly. He had anticipated. He had prepared for a crisis that others believed too unlikely to plan for. Eisenhower understood then that Patton's mind was always racing, ahead of the present moment, sometimes dangerously so, but in that winter, it had saved lives. Patton, for his part, felt the shift even without explicit praise. Eisenhower's silence was different now. It carried respect. That mattered more to Patton than medals or headlines. He had always craved acknowledgement, not from the public, but from those who understood the weight of command. Bastogne gave him that, even if it was never spoken aloud. Still, the moment did not soften Patton. He did not become patient or cautious, but it did deepen him. He began to understand that Eisenhower's restraint was not weakness, but burden, that the man who held the alliance together carried pressures Patton would never fully share. The battlefield was Patton's domain. The world beyond it belonged to Eisenhower. Eisenhower later reflected that Patton was a weapon, not a policy. A powerful one, essential when used correctly, dangerous when unleashed without boundaries. Bastogne was the moment that weapon had been aimed perfectly. Eisenhower believed history would remember that, even if it misunderstood much else about Patton. As the war moved toward its end, Eisenhower never forgot the lesson of Bastogne. He said that no commander, no matter how brilliant, should ever stand alone. Success came from tension between speed and control, aggression and restraint. Patton embodied one side of that tension. Eisenhower carried the other. When the war finally ended, the relief at Bastogne stood as one of the defining moments of Allied resolve, not because it was flawless, but because it proved something essential, that trust, once earned under fire, could change the course of history. Eisenhower's final judgment was simple and enduring. He said that when the 101st Airborne stood surrounded and freezing, when maps looked hopeless and time seemed to run out, Patton did not hesitate. And because he did not hesitate, an army lived. That, Eisenhower believed, was what command was truly about. Not glory, not reputation, not politics, but the willingness to act decisively when lives depended on it. In that winter, Patton saved the 101st, and Eisenhower never forgot it.